Hey everybody, it's Julianne from Cary Quilting Company in Cary, North Carolina. Happy New Year. Today is Tuesday, the 2nd of January of 2024. Hopefully you have resolved to do more quilting in 24, and I will keep doing the massive amount of quilting that I always do. Now today is our last day of questions and answers, and today I'm kind of calling potpourri because these are the questions and answers that didn't fit into previous categories from last week's questions and answers. And of course, if you submitted a question and I read your question here, you will have a prize from the shop. So just give us a call to figure out how to get that picked up or delivered to you. The first question we have today is from Debbie Palco. Debbie says, how do you pick a color for quilting the top of your quilt? So we're assuming she's talking about thread color, and I'll just show you here in this example. This is a quilt top that I pulled off of the shop floor, and if you love that top, this is the pattern for it. It's called May Flowers, and it's a nice pattern for giant big pieces. So if you want to get something done quickly, this is going to be your pattern. Now, this is something that our long arm quilters do often. So I pulled some threads from our long arm quilting room. It's basically just auditioning thread colors across different colors of fabric in your quilt top. So in this case, you can see that this gray one is really difficult across this. It almost looks white and it's not as saturated as the colors in the quilt. So I would pull gray away. And then even though this one is peach colored, it really reads white when you look at it on the surface of this quilt. So I don't really love that either. I think these other three colors are all contenders, but I will say that this gold color right here always works well. The gold color is magic. We use it so often. It's probably one of our most reordered colors here in the long arm quilting room. And then I think these two would also go well. It's always important to lay it across a lot of different parts of your quilt so you can see how it plays across lots of different surfaces. So that's my answer. I just like to lay them out and see what I can find that I like. And then once I like it, I quilt it. Or I get our amazing long arm team to quilt it more often than not. So thank you for your question, Debbie. Our next question is from Susan Macklin. She has a pattern that is written all in metric and is written in tenths of a yard. So she wants to know if there's any secret to translating metric to imperial, because most of quilting is done in yards and inches, not in centimeters and meters. I will say that's also a challenge of mine. I think I missed math class when we were talking about that way back when, but I do have a link that I will stick in today's descriptions of the video. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll pop it up there for you. And that has lots of nice little conversions for you if you have patterns from other countries and you want to turn them into patterns using yards and inches. Now, Beth asks if we should use foundations or not when we're doing string piecing. So I took the liberty of grabbing some pieces from home that I was already working on, and I did 3 sample blocks with you. So the first one over here I did on tracing paper, and I brought a piece of tracing paper here just to sort of show you the original paper. The second one I did on fabric foundation, and the third one I did with no foundation. And so I did those so that I could share with you the pros and cons of using foundations. So the pros of using foundations are that you get accuracy in terms of your square. When I was piecing this one, I had to keep throwing down my ruler to make sure that I was getting to the edges. Where on this one, I knew if I was getting to the edges because I was running out of foundation. Also, foundation is very important for keeping the grain from stretching, because if I've got another piece of fabric back there that is straight of grain, then these grains don't matter at all because it's not going to be able to stretch. And the same is true with paper as long as the paper is on the back. Of course, when you get this put together, you are going to be pulling the paper pieces off like this. So it's good for keeping the accuracy of the square while the paper is on the back. And then this is the one that I did not put any kind of foundation on. And when I pull this, look at that stretch. And I'm not even pulling hard. So the problem with doing string piecing is that a lot of these are not straight of grain. And when you start sewing them together, if you don't love pinning, you're going to have a mess. So every version of this, look at that one, every version of this is going to stretch. And once it stretches, now it's not even really square anymore. Now I've got these flippy edges. So The pros and cons to paper foundation versus fabric foundation. Paper foundation, obviously you have to take the time to remove the paper once you get this sewn into a quilt top, which can be annoying, just depending on how you feel about it. You also have to use a smaller stitch length so that you don't get little pieces of paper in your quilt. And a lot of people don't like sewing through paper with their sewing machine because now you've got little shreds of paper down in your sewing machine. The pros to this is you only have one layer of fabric when you're done. With a fabric foundation, you're always going to have 2 layers of fabric there. So it's going to make a thicker quilt. And if you're planning to hand quilt or big stitch quilt, now you've got another layer to go through because this fabric always stays there. So I trimmed 2 edges of these two just so you could see kind of how, when I put it together, I ran off the edge with my longer pieces of fabric. So there you go. If I'm doing a string piece, I'm never ever going to go without foundation because this is just a nightmare to me. Most often I'm going to go with paper foundation because tearing out paper doesn't really bother me. But if you want longevity, if you're looking for a quilt that's going to last longer, this extra piece of fabric also gives a lot of stability to the piecing stitches in the quilt top. So this is going to be your best answer for longevity.
I have a question.
Yes. Oh, Susan has a question from behind the camera.
So when you're long arming, does that additional piece of fabric cause an issue?
When you're long arming, the additional piece of fabric should not cause an issue. It will be just a little more to quilt through, and depending on how thick you want your quilt to be at the end, you may choose a thinner batting than maybe a wool batting or a very thick cotton batting, because this extra layer of cotton is going to add a little bit to the thickness and density and warmth of your quilt. Let's see, the next question comes from Abbey. She wants to know if tacking or tying is still a common way of combining the layers of a quilt. So tying is great for a variety of reasons. I wouldn't say that it's common, but it's definitely still a completely useful way to get the top, middle, and bottom of a quilt sandwich put together. Tying is good for quilts with dimensional elements like prairie points or flanges or things that you wouldn't want to run over with a sewing machine. So there are a lot of patterns that have little prairie points that open up to show designs underneath for kids. And so tacking or tying a quilt might be a good idea for something like that. Quilts with things that are hard to quilt through, like puffy paint. I used to do t-shirt quilts, and a lot of t-shirts that are created for the powder puff football game or whatever, and people are painting on them. Paint is really hard for a sewing machine needle to get through. So if you have elements that would be hard to sew through, that's also a great reason for tying a quilt. Quilts with super, super puffy batting, if you're doing like a double layer of wool, sometimes that tying or tacking gives a really nice kind of dimensional puff to a quilt. And if you want a quick finish or an affordable finish, because obviously it's going to take less time than machine quilting, it's going to be less expensive than long arm quilting, and really all you need is some embroidery floss and some time crawling around on the floor to do tacking or tying. And historically, older quilts, sometimes when a quilt wore out, it would be the inside of the next quilt sandwich. And so tacking or tying was sometimes the only option for those because you're going through so many layers. So sometimes in appraising, when we're looking at old quilts that feel kind of chunky inside, if we have a torn piece of fabric and we can kind of peek in, I have found old quilts inside of outside quilts. So that would be another reason to tack or tie. Reasons why you wouldn't want to tie a quilt are quilts that get lots of use. If you're doing a baby quilt and you imagine that it's going to go through the wash once a week, batting has every batting package and every batting manufacturer tells you how closely you need to tack it or tie it or quilt it in order for the batting to not literally fall apart inside your quilt. So if you are using a batting that needs closer stitches or closer ties, you'll want to pay attention to your batting, because otherwise you're going to end up with chunky, it's almost like hard cotton balls in the bottom corners of the quilt. When it gets washed a lot, the batting sort of disintegrates inside the quilt. And let's see, quilting helps secure the seams of your piecing. So when you put quilting on top of a quilt that is pieced, the quilting is almost like extra security, like locking the door. So those piecing seams are not going to pop apart as easily. And with a tied quilt, you don't have that same kind of insurance on your piecing stitches. So that's my answers to quilting or tying. I have tied quilts before. I don't like crawling all over the floor and pushing the needle up and down and up and down. But it certainly is a valid way to finish a quilt. The next question comes from Camille Cavallero. I hope I've said that right. And she wants to know how I got started with quilting. And the short story of this is that I've been sewing since I could reach the pedal of my mom's sewing machine, and I would sit next to her while she sewed and organize all of her spools of thread. And so I started making my own clothes and making things for my doll houses. And by the time I was out of college, I got really tired of buying fabric that didn't drape the way I expected, or the pattern didn't come out in the size that was perfect for me, or whatever. I just didn't enjoy spending a lot of time and money on fabric and not liking the finished product. So I took a look at my bed and I said, well, the bed doesn't change sizes, the bed doesn't care how it feels, and the bed is always going to be square. So I think I'm going to buy a book called Make Your Own Quilt. And that was back in 1995 or 96. And I've been quilting ever since. So that's how I got started in quilting. And as soon as I realized I could make beautiful designs and the bed didn't care how it felt or how it fit, then I was sold on that being my new passion with the sewing machine. So I hope you've enjoyed all of our video question and answers for the end of the year and the beginning of this year. Tomorrow we will be back with fabric because the fabric has been piling up back there, and we have plenty of new things to show you in the new year. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you back here from the shop tomorrow. Bye.